The phone call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. Sterling Pike thought it was about business. Instead, a lawyer's voice shattered his world. "Mr. Pike, there's been an accident. You're listed as emergency contact for 2 minors." 2 minors. Sterling's blood went cold. He'd been divorced for 12 months. He had no children, or so he thought. But how could a man who controlled every detail of his life miss something this massive? A man who read every contract twice, who knew his quarterly projections down to the penny, who never left anything to chance. Welcome back to Love Stories with Mr. Tyrell, where real love stories teach us real life lessons. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because today's story will change how you think about pride, love, and second chances forever. 12 months earlier, Sterling Pike sat across from his wife at a polished walnut conference table in downtown Chicago. Morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in sharp relief. The lawyer's voice droned through practiced phrases about asset division and residency requirements, while Sterling focused on the organized documents before him. This was how he preferred things: methodical, efficient, final. Arden sat smaller somehow, her hands folded in her lap, maintaining the controlled composure that had first attracted him 7 years ago. She wore the navy dress he'd bought her for their anniversary, though he wondered if that choice was intentional or simply habit. "The final decree will be processed within 30 days, the lawyer continued, sliding papers across the table. "Mr. Pike, if you'll sign here, and Mrs. Pike, your signature goes here." Sterling's pen moved without hesitation. Decisive strokes. Clean action. When he finished, he looked up to find Arden staring at him, her pen hovering over the signature line. "You're sure?" he asked, though he wasn't certain what answer he wanted. Arden's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the pen. "I'm sure this is what you want, Sterling." Not what she wanted, what he wanted. The distinction hit him like cold water, but he pushed the feeling aside. This was business now. Organized papers, signed documents, closed chapters. She signed her name in careful script, the same handwriting that had filled birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes tucked into his briefcase. When she finished, she set the pen down and folded her hands again. The lawyer gathered the documents with professional efficiency. "That concludes our business today." Sterling expected an argument, tears, some kind of dramatic scene. Instead, Arden stood quietly, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the door. No goodbye kiss, no final words, no looking back. He watched her leave and felt something hollow expand in his chest. But he told himself it was relief. 4 weeks before that conference room, Arden Pike had stood in her bathroom at dawn, staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her hand flew to her mouth, then pressed against her still flat stomach. After 3 years of trying, of hoping, of monthly disappointments, it had finally happened. She sank onto the edge of the bathtub, overwhelmed. The doctor would confirm it that afternoon, but she already knew. Her body felt different, charged with new purpose. That evening, she'd set the good china on their dining room table, lit candles, and waited for Sterling to come home. She had the test wrapped in tissue paper, a speech rehearsed about new beginnings and growing families. Sterling arrived at 9:30, his tie loosened, jaw tight with whatever stress had consumed his day. He barely glanced at the candles or the carefully prepared meal. "We need to talk," he said, not even sitting down. Arden's heart hammered as she watched him pace their living room, hands in his pockets, avoiding her eyes. "This marriage feels suffocating, Arden. I need space to think, to breathe. I think we both know this isn't working anymore." She sat frozen, the pregnancy test burning in her purse. Sterling continued talking about growing apart and different directions, but his words became background noise. She realized with devastating clarity that he'd been leaving her for months, maybe years. This conversation was just the formality. When he finally stopped talking and looked at her expectantly, Arden made a choice that would define the rest of their lives. She would not use this baby as a bargaining chip. She would not beg him to stay with news of a pregnancy. She would not trap him with a child he clearly didn't want, in a marriage he was already abandoning. "If that's what you want," she said quietly, "no life should begin as a negotiation. No child should enter the world as evidence in an argument about love." Sterling helped her pack that night, though helped was generous. He mostly stood in doorways while she folded clothes and wrapped picture frames in newspaper. The efficiency of it surprised him. 7 years reduced to boxes and suitcases in 3 hours. When her car disappeared around the corner, taillights swallowed by darkness, Sterling returned to their house and felt the silence settle around him like dust. He'd gotten exactly what he wanted: space, freedom, organized simplicity. So why did his chest feel hollow? Arden drove to her sister's house with 2 suitcases, a box of books, and a secret that grew heavier with each mile. She would raise this child alone, she decided. Sterling had made his choice, and she would make hers. What Sterling didn't realize as he stood in his empty house, adjusting the thermostat and checking the locks, was that his biggest mistake wasn't the divorce. It wasn't even walking away from Arden, though that would haunt him soon enough. His biggest mistake was what he'd never know he was walking away from: a tiny heartbeat that would grow into the most important person in his world. A child who would carry his eyes and Arden's stubborn chin, who would take first steps and speak first words without him. But that revelation was still 12 months away, waiting in a lawyer's phone call that would change everything: the divorce. It wasn't even walking away from Arden, though that would haunt him soon enough. His biggest mistake was what he'd never know he was walking away from: a tiny heartbeat that would grow into the most important person in his world. A child who would carry his eyes and Arden's stubborn chin, who would take first steps and speak first words without him. But that revelation was still 12 months away, waiting in a lawyer's phone call that would change everything. 2 hours north of Chicago, Arden found herself in a lakeside town where rent cost half what she'd paid before, and neighbors actually waved when they passed on the street. Her apartment sat above a used bookstore, with windows that overlooked the water and floors that creaked in welcoming ways. She took a job at the bookstore cafe downstairs, where the air always smelled of coffee and old paper. The owner, Mrs. Rodriguez, asked no questions about her past and simply handed her an apron on her first day. "You look like someone who needs a fresh start," she'd said, with a knowing smile. Arden's days developed a rhythm that felt humble but entirely hers. Morning shifts brewing coffee and recommending novels to customers who lingered over their purchases. Afternoon walks along the lake, her hand resting on her growing stomach as she whispered conversations to the life growing inside her. "I don't know how we'll do this," she'd say to her reflection in the water, "but we will." Her body changed in ways that amazed her. Not just the obvious expansion, but the way her heart seemed to heal differently than she'd expected. Less shattered, more steady. She learned to fold tiny clothes she bought at thrift stores, learned to breathe through moments of worry about money and the future, learned to accept help when Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on sending her home with leftover soup. The woman who had once coordinated charity galas and managed Sterling's social calendar now found joy in simple things: a customer's laugh, the way afternoon light hit her kitchen table, the flutter of movement that reminded her she wasn't truly alone. At night, she'd sit by her window and watch boats drift across the lake, their lights like scattered stars. Sometimes she thought about Sterling, wondered if he ever thought about her, if he'd ever know about the child they'd created together. But those thoughts came less frequently now, replaced by practical concerns about cribs and pediatricians and how to raise a baby on a bookstore salary. She was becoming someone new. Not the broken wife who'd signed divorce papers, but a woman discovering her own strength. A mother preparing to love fiercely, even if she had to do it alone. At 20 weeks, Arden lay on the examination table in the town's small medical clinic, gel cold on her stomach, as the technician moved the ultrasound wand across her skin. She'd been here before, but today felt different somehow. "Well," the technician said, pausing the wand and leaning closer to the screen, "you've got quite a surprise here." Arden's heart stopped. "Is something wrong?" "Wrong? No, honey. You've got 2 heartbeats on this screen. Twins." The word hit Arden like lightning. She turned to stare at the monitor, where 2 distinct flickers pulsed in rhythm, like tiny drums beating in perfect time. Her hand flew to her mouth as laughter and tears came simultaneously. "Twins," she whispered, the word feeling both unreal and miraculous and terrifying all at once. The technician printed extra photos, smiling at Arden's reaction. Double the blessing, double the work, but double the love too. That night, Arden sat at her kitchen table with the ultrasound photos spread before her, tracing the grainy outlines with her finger. 2 babies. 2 complete human beings growing inside her, each with their own heartbeat, their own future. She thought about Sterling for the first time in weeks, wondering what his face would look like if he could see these images. Would he soften? Would he care? The memory of his stone expression as he signed the divorce papers answered her question. "It's just us," she told the photos. "But we're going to be okay. More than okay. We're going to be loved." But 200 miles away, Sterling was about to learn that success without love is just expensive loneliness. Sterling's life had become a series of meetings in glass conference rooms, deals closed over expensive dinners, and nights alone in his spotless penthouse. His colleagues told him he looked lighter these days, offering subtle congratulations on his newfound freedom. He accepted their comments with practiced smiles. The divorce had been clean, efficient, exactly as he'd wanted. Arden was capable. She'd always handled things well. She would be fine without him. Probably better off. He told himself this during late-night moments when he reached for his phone to call her, then stopped, realizing he had no words to say. He filled the silence with work, expanding his business, purchasing properties, attending charity events where photographers captured his smile for society pages. From the outside, Sterling Pike was thriving. Successful, unencumbered, free to pursue whatever he wanted. But freedom, he was learning, could feel remarkably like emptiness. His penthouse echoed with his footsteps. Meals for one felt absurd at a dining table built for 8. He found himself working later, staying at the office until security guards made their rounds, anything to avoid the quiet that followed him home. At those charity events, surrounded by Chicago's elite, he'd catch himself scanning crowds for Arden's face, forgetting for a moment that she was no longer part of his world. The realization always hit like cold water. Sometimes, in the space between sleep and waking, he'd wonder if he should call her. Not to reconcile, that ship had sailed, but to ask if she was okay. To say he was sorry he'd given up. Sorry he hadn't chosen her when it mattered. But morning always came with its demands, and the moment would pass, buried under emails and appointments, and the relentless pursuit of more success. The months passed this way. Arden's belly grew round with twins, while Sterling's bank account grew fat with profits. She learned to sleep on her side and navigate morning sickness while working. He learned that achievement without someone to share it with felt hollow. Neither knew that their paths would cross again in the most unexpected way, when crisis would force them to confront what they'd both lost. Drop a comment if you've ever felt successful on the outside, but empty on the inside. Sterling's Tuesday afternoon had been proceeding with its usual precision when his assistant knocked on his office door. "There's a lawyer on line 3, she said, "from Lake County. He says it's urgent." Sterling assumed it was business, perhaps something related to the property development he'd been considering up north. He picked up the phone expecting to discuss contracts or zoning permits. Instead, a careful voice delivered words that stopped his world. "Mr. Pike, this is attorney Michael Brennan. I'm calling about Arden Vale. There's been an incident involving her vehicle. You are listed as emergency contact for 2 minors. Please contact me immediately regarding their immediate care." Sterling stared at his desk, focusing on the wood grain patterns while his stomach twisted into knots. Emergency contact for 2 minors. Arden Vale. She'd taken back her maiden name after the divorce. But children. His mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. He called back within minutes, his hands shaking as he dialed. "Mr. Pike," the lawyer's voice was measured, professional, "I need to inform you that Arden recently gave birth to twins. According to hospital records and her emergency contact information, you are listed as their father and emergency contact." "What?" The word came out strangled. Sterling's blood ran cold as the implications crashed over him. "Twins?" "Yes, sir. Born approximately 8 months ago. Ms. Vale was involved in a single-vehicle accident this morning after leaving a pediatric appointment. She's alive but hospitalized with injuries. The children were taken to our local clinic for evaluation." Sterling's ears began ringing. 8 months ago. That meant Arden had been pregnant during their divorce proceedings. She'd sat across from him at that conference table, signed those papers, walked away, all while carrying his children. "The clinic is requesting immediate assistance," the lawyer continued. "They're a small facility, and with the storm damage from last night, they're dealing with power outages and limited resources. These babies need proper care, and frankly, we need someone who can help coordinate better medical support." Sterling felt his chest constrict, as if wrapped in wire. Twins. His children. His responsibility. Children who had been breathing, growing, existing in the world for 8 months while he'd been congratulating himself on his freedom. The details came in fragments that Sterling struggled to process. Arden's car had slid off the road near a sharp bend by the river, likely due to the morning's heavy rain. She'd been driving back from the baby's 8-month checkup when it happened. "She's conscious and stable," the lawyer explained, "but she has a concussion and some broken ribs. The babies weren't seriously injured. Their car seats did their job, but they're shaken up, and the clinic is concerned about keeping them overnight." The local clinic, Sterling learned, was barely equipped for routine care, let alone emergency situations. Last night's storm had damaged their backup generator, leaving them with intermittent power. They needed supplies, proper equipment, and ideally, transport to a better-equipped facility. "Ms. Vale keeps asking about the children," the lawyer added quietly. "She's worried about their care while she recovers. When we contacted you as the emergency contact, she seemed relieved, but also concerned about your reaction." Sterling found himself standing, without remembering when he'd risen from his chair. His usual response to crisis was methodical planning, careful consideration of options, consultation with advisors. But something different was happening now. something that bypassed his analytical mind entirely. "I'm coming," he said, already reaching for his keys. "Sir, the roads are still dangerous from the storm. I'm coming now." For the first time in a long time, Sterling Pike didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consult his calendar or consider the board meeting he was supposed to attend. He simply moved, like the part of him that used to love was finally awake after months of hibernation. The rain hammered Sterling's windshield as he navigated the treacherous roads leading north. His expensive car, built for comfort and status, felt useless against the elements. Every mile stretched endlessly, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. How could he not have known? The question tormented him as he drove through sheets of rain that made visibility nearly impossible. But even as he asked it, a deeper, more uncomfortable question emerged. Did he not know, or had he made it too unsafe for Arden to tell him? He remembered her face at the conference table, the way her fingers had trembled as she held the pen. He'd been so focused on his own need for freedom, his own discomfort with their marriage, that he'd missed everything else. Had she tried to tell him? Had there been signs he'd been too self-absorbed to see? The memory of their last real conversation came flooding back. His pacing, his speech about needing space, his certainty that ending their marriage was the right choice. Arden had sat so quietly, so still. He'd interpreted her calm as agreement, but now he wondered if it had been something else entirely. She'd been carrying more than heartbreak when she walked out of that conference room. She'd been carrying his children, and he'd been too wrapped up in his own needs to notice. Every mile felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't he seen? What kind of man walks away from his family without even knowing they exist? The storm seemed to mirror the chaos in his mind, wind and rain, and the constant threat of losing control. But beneath the self-recrimination, something else was building. A desperate urgency to reach them, to see these children, to somehow make right what he'd unknowingly made wrong. As he drove through the storm toward a future he couldn't have imagined 12 hours ago, Sterling realized that everything he thought he'd wanted, everything he'd worked for since the divorce, meant nothing compared to what he was racing toward now. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to see when he finally arrived at that small lakeside clinic. The clinic parking lot was packed with cars and emergency vehicles, their headlights cutting through the continuing rain. A generator hummed loudly near the building's entrance, casting everything in harsh mechanical light. Sterling ran from his car, his expensive suit soaking through within seconds. Inside, anxious families filled the waiting area, while staff moved with controlled urgency. Sterling approached the front desk, water dripping from his hair. "I'm Sterling Pike," he announced to the nurse behind the counter. "I'm here about the twins." "You're the father," she interrupted, relief flooding her voice. "Thank goodness. We need help. Follow me." She led him down a narrow hallway to a small room where two bassinets sat side by side under warm lighting. Sterling stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. Two tiny faces, red and scrunched from crying, peered up at him. Their arms moved in swimming motions, small fists opening and closing. One had dark hair like his own, the other lighter, like Arden's. Both had the same serious expression, as if they were studying this stranger who'd suddenly appeared in their world. Sterling had negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, had stood before boardrooms full of skeptical investors and commanded their respect. But this moment, staring at two pieces of himself he'd never known existed, left him completely frozen. "Nothing prepared me for this," he whispered to himself. The nurse touched his arm gently. "Sir, we need to transfer them to a better facility. Our backup power is failing, and we don't have the supplies for overnight care. The storm damaged our usual transport options." Sterling snapped into action, his business instincts finally kicking in. "Tell me what you need." Within an hour, he'd made a dozen phone calls. Emergency medical supplies were being rushed from Chicago. A private medical transport team was en route, despite the dangerous roads. He'd arranged for a pediatric specialist to meet them at the regional hospital. As he coordinated the logistics, Sterling kept glancing at the bassinets. Money couldn't undo the past 8 months, couldn't give him back the moments he'd missed, their first breaths, their first smiles, the nights Arden had walked the floor alone while they cried. But it could keep his children warm tonight. It could ensure they received the best possible care. For the first time since the divorce, Sterling's wealth felt like more than just a scorecard. It felt like responsibility. The hospital room was small and sterile, filled with the steady beeping of monitors. Arden lay propped against pillows, her face pale and bruised, an IV line snaking from her arm. When Sterling stepped inside, she opened her eyes slowly, as if she wasn't sure whether he was real or just another concussion-induced hallucination. They stared at each other in silence, both bracing for whatever came next, disappointment, anger, or perhaps just the awkwardness of two people who'd once shared everything and now shared nothing but DNA with 2 babies down the hall. "Arden." Sterling's voice cracked on her name. "You know," she said simply. "Not a question, just a statement of fact." "I didn't," he said, moving closer to her bed. "I swear to you, I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Arden replied quietly. "Because I didn't tell you." Sterling stopped at the edge of her bed, his hands gripping the metal rail. "Why?" Arden's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for months. "Because I didn't want them to be a reason. I wanted love to be the reason you stayed, not obligation." The words hit Sterling like physical blows. He understood now, with devastating clarity, what his request for divorce had really meant to her. "You thought I didn't love you anymore. You left like I didn't matter," Arden whispered. "Like what we had was just an inconvenience you needed to clear from your schedule." Sterling wanted to reach for her, but stopped himself. He didn't deserve to comfort her. Not yet. "I was proud," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was scared of how much I needed you, how much our marriage mattered to me. Instead of admitting that, I blamed you for the weight of my own life." Arden turned her head to look at him fully. "I didn't want to beg you to stay, Sterling. Not for me, and not for them. No child should start life as a negotiation." "You shouldn't have had to beg," Sterling said, his voice breaking. "You should have been able to tell me about the pregnancy and know that I'd be thrilled. You should have felt safe enough to share that news." Slowly, carefully, he reached out and brushed his fingers against her hand. She didn't pull away. "I'm not just sorry about the divorce," he continued. "I'm sorry for making you feel alone in our marriage. I'm sorry for making it easier for you to disappear than to be honest with me about something this important." Arden's guard began to soften slightly. "I didn't want you to come back because you felt forced to. I didn't want you to resent them, or me, for trapping you." Sterling's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "I came because the moment I heard about them, the moment I saw them, I realized I'd been living like success could replace love, like achievement could fill the hole I created when I walked away from you." The storm continued outside, but inside the hospital room, something steadier was growing between them. Sterling had shed his suit jacket hours ago, rolled up his sleeves, and set aside his watch. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about quarterly reports or board meetings. They took turns holding the babies, checking on each other, sharing the quiet intimacy of new parents despite everything that had happened between them. When one of the twins, a girl, Sterling learned, began to fuss, Arden's face immediately filled with concern. "Do they look okay to you?" she asked, studying the baby's face with the intensity only a mother could possess. Sterling looked down at his daughter, then at his son sleeping peacefully in the nearby bassinet. "They're perfect," he said, and meant it completely. The nurse brought the baby to Arden's arms, and Sterling watched her face light up as she cradled their daughter. The love there was so pure, so fierce, that it took his breath away. "You did this," he said softly. "You carried them for 9 months. You protected them. You gave birth to them alone and raised them for 8 months without any help from me." Arden looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "You were supposed to be my partner in this." Sterling reached out and brushed his thumb across her knuckles again, feeling her shoulders relax slightly under his touch. "I know, and if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be that now." The past couldn't be erased. The months of separation and pain couldn't vanish. But sitting there in that hospital room, watching Arden hold their children, Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. Share this video if you believe in second chances and the power of love to heal. The morning after brought clearer roads and the sound of medical transport vehicles arriving at the hospital. Sterling had spent the night making arrangements, coordinating the transfer to a better facility, securing a recovery rental near the hospital so Arden wouldn't have to travel far, ensuring the twins had access to the best pediatric care available. He didn't announce these actions or post about them on social media. He simply did what needed to be done, the way he should have been doing all along. As they prepared for the transfer, Arden watched him organize details with quiet efficiency. Finally, she asked the question that had been building since he'd arrived. "Why are you doing all this, Sterling?" He paused in his phone conversation with the transport coordinator and looked at her directly. "Because I finally understand something I should have known years ago. Life isn't something you manage from a distance. It's something you show up for, even when it's messy and complicated and doesn't fit your timeline." He glanced at the twins, now sleeping peacefully in their carriers. "I can't change the day I walked away from you. I can't get back the months I missed with them, but I can change every day that comes after this one." Arden studied his face, searching for the man she'd once loved beneath the stranger he'd become. "And what about us? What happens when the crisis is over and real life starts again?" Sterling moved closer, but not too close. He was learning to respect the space his choices had created. "I'm not asking you to forget what happened or to trust me immediately. I'm asking for the chance to earn my way back into your life, into their lives, one day at a time." Arden's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained cautious. "If you want to try, then start with being consistent. Start with being kind. Start with telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." Sterling nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking. "That I can do." Sterling and Arden's story teaches us that our biggest mistakes aren't usually made in moments of anger, but in moments of pride. When we're so focused on protecting ourselves that we forget to protect the people we love. Love isn't just a feeling you have when things are easy. It's a decision you make when things get hard. It's choosing to stay present instead of running away. It's choosing vulnerability over self-protection. Real strength isn't loud or dramatic. It's the daily choice to show up, to be honest, to do the work of loving someone even when your ego wants to quit. Sterling thought he needed rescuing from the weight of his marriage, but what he really needed was to come back to his own heart. The real rescue wasn't the money he spent or the supplies he provided. It was his willingness to admit he'd been wrong. The people you love aren't extras in your life story. They aren't interruptions to your success or obstacles to your freedom. They are the point. They are why success matters in the first place. Second chances are possible, but they're built on consistency, kindness, and truth, not grand gestures or expensive gifts. Let me ask you something. What lesson from Sterling and Arden's story hit you the hardest? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Love Stories with Mr. Tyrell for more real love stories that teach real life lessons. Smash that like button if you believe love deserves a second chance, even when we mess it up the first time. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose love over pride, connection over control. Until next time, remember, the people you love aren't interruptions to your life. They are the reason for it. And speaking of second chances, wait until you hear next week's story about